The fire licked along the wooden doorframe, devouring every grain of timber with hunger. Inside the small house, a woman wrenched desperately at the rope binding her wrists to the chair. The smoke sank lower, thick and choking, clawing down her throat in searing waves. She coughed, she cried for help, but her voice had cracked into hoarse rasps that dissolved into the roar of the flames. Above her, the roof began to groan. Out in the yard, the three figures were in no hurry. They tossed the last bundles of papers into the trunk, slammed it shut, and one of them glanced back at the blaze with a thin smile. The engine growled to life, headlights sweeping once across the darkness, and they sped away, certain that by morning nothing would remain but ashes and a secret buried forever. No one believed anyone would come. A lone house on the edge of the city, a moonless night, a woman with no one left in the world to call her name. It all should have ended there. But on the dark road beyond the fence, a black car that had just pulled up suddenly braked hard. In the back seat, a massive Neapolitan Mastiff lurched upright, its thick coat bristling, a deep, booming bark echoing through the car. The moment the door cracked open, the 60-kilogram beast charged out, its heavy paws pounding across the burning grass, straight toward the flames. The man who stepped out after it froze for a single beat, a man whose name the whole city lowered its voice to speak. A man whose hands were familiar with power and with a merciless code all his own. A man whose heart, people believed, had gone cold long ago. And yet that night, it was he who chased after his dog, plunging into the inferno to pull a stranger back from the hands of death. He did not yet know that the woman in that fire held something capable of burning an entire empire to the ground. And she did not yet know that the man who had just saved her was the most dangerous person she would ever meet. If this story made you catch your breath even for a second, send us a like and a share so it can reach more hearts. Subscribe to our channel now, and walk with us all the way to the end of their journey. To understand how they survived that deadly night, we must step back inside the roaring flames where their fates first intertwined. Inside, the world had become nothing but smoke and the roar of fire. Elliot charged through the doorway Bishop had just smashed open, one arm shielding his face. His eyes narrowed as he searched through the thick black haze. The heat slapped against his skin as though it meant to peel him apart layer by layer. The dog barked frantically from the corner of the room, the sound tearing through the sharp crackle of burning wood and guiding him forward. Elliot followed it, keeping low where the smoke was thinner, and then he saw her. The woman had collapsed beside the wall, her head tilted to one side, both wrists still bound tightly to the frame of the chair that had tipped crookedly beneath her. She wasn't moving. Bishop lunged toward her, pressing his body close against hers as though trying to rouse her back to life, then turned back to look at his master, his eyes shining in the ring of firelight. Elliot dropped to his knees. He reached for the rope, fingers that were used to guns and violence now yanking hard at the knot digging into her skin. The knot wouldn't come loose. He drew the knife from his hip, slipped the steel blade into the gap, and pulled in one clean, decisive motion. The rope snapped. Her arm fell limp. Overhead, a crossbeam gave out a long, terrifying groan, and sparks scattered down onto his shoulders. There wasn't a second left to hesitate. Elliot lifted her up, one arm around her back, the other tucked beneath her knees, raising the woman as though she weighed no more than a dry leaf. He spun around. Bishop was already pushing ahead with powerful strides, his deep barks guiding the way. Elliot ran after the dog, cutting through the sea of fire, driving his shoulder into the collapsing doorframe to force the exit wider. Just as his foot struck the grass outside, the whole house behind him shuddered once, and then caved in, the main beam snapping and dragging half the roof down onto the exact spot where he had just been standing. A massive burst of flame erupted, throwing scorching heat against their backs. Elliot didn't look back. He ran a little farther until they were far enough from the fire, then dropped to his knees and laid the woman down on the cold ground. She wasn't breathing. Her face was smeared with black ash, and her lips had turned a lifeless shade of pale. Elliot pressed 2 fingers to her neck. There was a pulse, but it was weak, fragile as a thread about to break. He tilted her head to one side, brushed the hair away from her face, then placed both hands over the center of her chest and pressed down. 1 beat, 2 beats, 3 beats, steady and firm. Bishop stood beside them, whining deep in his throat, his nose pressed close to her cheek. Elliot bent down, put his ear near her mouth to listen, then continued compressing her chest, his palms rhythmically pressing over the heart of a human being he had never even met. "Come on," he said softly, his voice low and hoarse. Don't give up now. She still lay motionless. He pressed down again, harder this time. Then suddenly, her body convulsed. A violent cough burst from her chest. She gagged, gasped, and arched up from the ground as her body tried to force the poisonous smoke out. Her eyes flew open, terrified and wild, her pupils shifting unsteadily before she could make sense of anything around her. She opened her mouth as if to scream, but only a broken, rasping sound came out. The instinct to survive surged through her, and she thrashed, both hands striking wildly at the air as she tried to shove away the shadow of the man leaning over her. Easy, Elliot said, backing up a little and raising both hands where she could see them. You're safe now. She didn't hear him. She crawled backward across the ground in jerking movements until her back hit a tree trunk, her breathing ragged, her whole body trembling violently. Her eyes had gone frantic with fear, moving from the fire devouring the house behind him to the unfamiliar face in front of her. Bishop slowly stepped closer, lowering his body and rubbing his head against her shaking hand. That sudden warmth made her freeze. She looked at the dog, then at the man, her lips moving around a question that never found a voice. She fought for one more breath, but her body had been drained of its last drop of strength. Her eyelids sank shut, and she collapsed to one side, slipping into darkness in the arms of the man who had just pulled her back from death. When Maggie opened her eyes again, the first thing she felt wasn't fire, but a strange, almost impossible stillness. She was lying across the back seat of a spacious car, her head resting on a folded coat, the smell of leather and burnt smoke tangled together in the air. She sat up too fast, and dizziness swept through her skull. Both hands clutched the edge of the seat as her eyes darted around, searching for a way out. The man was sitting in the seat across from her, his back straight, one leg crossed over the other, silently watching her as though he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. The dim light inside the car cast hard lines across his face and deepened the darkness in his eyes, calm in a way that only frightened her more. She backed herself against the door, one hand feeling blindly for the handle. I won't keep you here if you want to leave, he said, his voice low and even, without the slightest hurry. But if you step outside now, with both lungs full of smoke, you'll collapse before you make it 10 steps. Maggie froze. Her hand was still on the door handle, but she didn't press it down. Her throat burned raw, and every breath still hurt, as though she had swallowed hot coal. Who are you? She asked, her voice so hoarse and small it nearly dissolved into the air. The man didn't answer right away. He looked at her for a long moment, then replied curtly, someone who happened to be passing by. That vague answer didn't comfort her at all. On the contrary, it made her even more tense. She knew very well that no one in this world suddenly rushed into a burning house for a stranger and then simply said he happened to be passing by. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, studying every movement, searching for some sign of bad intent, but he didn't move closer. He didn't reach for her. He only remained still at a safe distance, leaving her to decide for herself whether she should trust him or not. It was that very calmness that left her confused. She was used to men who shouted, threatened, and gave orders. This man was different, cold but not savage, like a stone wall standing unmoved in the middle of a storm. A faint scratching sound came from the car door on the other side. He reached out and opened it, and the mastiff climbed heavily onto the seat, maneuvering his massive frame closer toward Maggie. She stiffened, shrinking back on instinct. But the dog showed no trace of aggression. It lowered its huge head and slowly rested its heavy, wrinkled muzzle on her knee, letting her feel the comforting weight of his large body as its dark eyes lifted toward her with a strange tenderness. In that moment, Maggie realized this was the very animal she had seen first when she woke in the sea of fire, the nose that had pressed against her cheek when she had believed she was already dead. Almost against her will, her hand slowly loosened from the door handle and lowered until it touched the dog's fur. The dog gave a soft, satisfied whine deep in its throat and pressed closer against her. His name is Bishop, the man said, his voice softening in a way almost too slight to notice. He rarely goes near anyone. Maggie looked down at the dog, and for the first time since waking, her breathing began to slow. Why did you save me? She whispered, without looking up. He was silent for a moment, then said, It wasn't me. He found you first. Maggie lifted her head. Fear still lingered in her eyes, but some of the guardedness had eased. They won't look for me, she said quietly, her voice catching. There's no one left to look for me anymore. She said nothing more, and she didn't cry. She only lowered her head and buried her fingers in Bishop's warm fur, as though clinging to the only thing that still felt real in the night that had taken everything from her. The man looked at her, and something flickered through his eyes, something she couldn't read in time. He didn't ask anything else. He didn't offer comfort. He only tapped lightly on the glass partition, and the car rolled smoothly into the night, leaving behind the ashes that were slowly growing cold. The car drove for nearly an hour before leaving the dark roads on the edge of the city and turning onto a private drive that led up the hill. Maggie sat still the entire way, one hand resting on Bishop's back, her eyes fixed beyond the window, where the city lights slowly thinned out and gave way to the darkness of tall trees. Only when the car stopped before a massive iron gate did she truly understand that she was entering a place that didn't belong to her world. Two men in suits stood guard on either side of the gate, their backs straight, their eyes cold and sharp, and the moment they recognized the car, they bowed their heads. The gate opened slowly without a sound, and the car slipped into a wide courtyard so silent it made her skin prickle. Maggie swallowed hard. She had once thought she understood what wealth looked like, but this place wasn't the kind of wealth she had ever imagined. It was cold. It was quiet. It breathed out a kind of power that made people lower their voices without meaning to and step more softly than they had before. The man got out first, then stood waiting beside the door without rushing her. Maggie followed with the dog pressed close to her, her legs still trembling, partly from exhaustion and partly from a new caution rising inside her chest. She wondered where she had fallen now, after being pulled out of a fire, and what price would be demanded for surviving it. Several servants appeared in the hallway, each one bowing to the man before silently withdrawing, and not one of them dared look directly at him for more than a second. The way they held their breath when he passed told Maggie more than any introduction ever could. This man wasn't a chance savior. This man was a force. When they entered the main hall, a man in his 40s came out to greet them, his build solid, his face cleanly shaven, a polite smile already fixed on his lips. "You're back," he said, his voice full of concern. "I was starting to worry." The man answered with a curt nod. "Dorsey, prepare a room for her, and call a doctor to check whether her lungs are all right." The man named Dorsey turned his eyes toward Maggie. His gaze passed over her filthy, ash-smeared state, and for one very brief moment, the smile on his mouth seemed to sag, while something calculating flashed in his eyes before she could catch hold of it. Then his warmth returned as quickly as it had vanished. "Of course," he said. "Has the young lady had some misfortune?" Before Maggie could answer, Bishop suddenly stopped beside her legs. The dog lowered its head, and a low, muffled growl rumbled from deep in its throat, its ears drawing back, its eyes fixed tightly on Dorsey. It was only a very soft sound, gone almost as soon as it came, but it was enough to make the air in the hall thicken for a single beat. The man glanced down at the dog, his brow tightening slightly. "Bishop," he called under his breath. The dog stopped growling, but it still didn't take its eyes off Dorsey. Its body pressed close against Maggie's leg, like a small wall standing between her and the other man. Dorsey let out a laugh, light and easy, as though nothing had happened. "Your dog is in a difficult mood today," he said, then turned on his heel to handle the task he had been given. His steps neither hurried nor slow. Maggie watched his figure disappear down the hallway, a vague feeling she couldn't name settling inside her, but she was too tired to think about it. The man turned to her, and for the first time, his voice carried a trace of something almost gentle. "You'll stay here tonight," he said. "No one can touch you inside these walls." Maggie looked up at him, still unable to understand why someone like him would care whether she lived or died. "My name is Maggie," she said softly, as though she needed to offer one small piece of herself in exchange for a little safety. The man looked at her for a while. "Elliot," he replied, and that was the only name he gave her that night, a name she didn't yet know the entire city feared to speak aloud. The days that followed passed slowly in the spacious room overlooking the garden behind the mansion. Maggie slept a great deal, coughed a great deal, and spent most of the time that remained watching. She was someone who had learned how to read people in order to survive, and this place gave her far too much to read. She realized that Elliot rarely spoke, rarely smiled, and that the people under him always kept a distance shaped by fear and respect. But there was one thing that confused her, and that was Bishop. Every early morning, when she thought the whole house was still asleep, she would see him sitting out on the porch with the dog, that hand of his, usually so cold, stroking its fur with patient care, sometimes even leaning down to say a few words to it so softly she couldn't hear them. In those moments, his face loosened. The layer of frost that always seemed to cling to him melted away, and she caught a glimpse of another man, hidden beneath the shell the entire city feared. One afternoon, while she was sitting on the porch with Bishop lying at her feet, Elliot stepped outside and sat in a chair some distance away. The two of them remained silent for a long time, with only the sound of the wind slipping through the trees. Then Maggie, without understanding why, was the one who spoke first. "You're not like what people are afraid of," she said. Elliot didn't look at her, his eyes still fixed on the garden. "You don't know what people are afraid of in me," he replied. After a while, he went on, his voice sinking lower. "You've probably heard people say I could burn a person alive over one wrong word. Maybe that's true." Maggie turned to look at him. There was something in the way he said it that made her understand there was an unhealed wound behind those words. "I once had someone," he said, slowly, as though every word carried weight. "Her name was Rosa. 3 years ago, someone told me she had betrayed me, that she had sold information to outsiders. I believed it. I trusted the wrong person, and by the time I realized the truth, it was too late. She was gone." He stopped, his jaw tightening. "I didn't kill her with my own hands. I killed her with my suspicion. From that day on, I never allowed myself to trust anyone again." Maggie fell silent. She looked at the powerful man sitting there, with a loneliness that neither money nor power could fill. And for the first time, he no longer seemed frightening to her, only pitiful in a way that belonged to him alone. The silence lasted a long while before it was her turn. "I lost someone too," she said softly. "My husband. He worked in a factory, a place people knew perfectly well wasn't safe, but they still forced the workers to go on. One morning, he went to work and never came home. They called it an accident, gave me a few words of sympathy, then closed the file as if his life hadn't been worth anything." Her voice trembled faintly, but it didn't break. "Then my mother fell ill. The debts my husband left behind, the debts they forced me to carry, grew so large that I no longer had money for her medicine. She died in the winter, and I sat beside her with nothing I could do." Maggie lowered her head and placed her hand on Bishop. "After that, I was alone, working to pay debts that weren't mine, living in a house people were always waiting to take from me." She lifted her face, her eyes shining, though she didn't let a single tear fall. "So when you asked whether anyone would come looking for me, that's why I said there was no one left. I wasn't trying to pity myself. It was just the truth." Elliot looked at her for a very long time. The two of them sat there, each carrying a wound of their own. One wounded because he had trusted the wrong person, the other because the whole world had turned its back. And in the stillness of that afternoon, the two wounds seemed to reflect each other, to recognize each other, without needing one more word of comfort. Bishop gave a quiet sigh at their feet, as though he understood too. By the 4th day, when a little strength had returned to her, Maggie asked Elliot to let her stop by the old neighborhood where she had once lived, only to see what was left of the ruined house, and to let a few kind neighbors know she was still alive. Elliot didn't ask many questions. He only nodded and said he would take her himself. When the car turned onto the familiar poor street, Maggie immediately noticed a small crowd gathered in front of an old grocery store. A large man was cornering an elderly shopkeeper against the wall, his hand slamming hard onto the counter, his booming voice threatening her over a debt she couldn't pay. A few people stood around with their heads lowered, but no one dared interfere. Maggie recognized the old woman. She was the one who had once secretly slipped a loaf of bread into Maggie's hands on the days when hunger had nearly hollowed her out. Her heart tightened. She clenched her hand into the hem of her dress, about to open the door and rush out, but Elliot placed one hand on her shoulder, signaling for her to stay still. He got out of the car first, his walk unhurried. Yet every step carried a kind of authority that seemed to make the whole street hold its breath. Bishop jumped down after him, keeping close to his master's heels. The debt collector looked up, ready to shout at the man who had just stepped in, but the moment he recognized the face coming toward him, his expression changed at once. His aggression vanished, replaced by fear that showed plainly in his eyes. "I didn't know she was under your protection," the man stammered. "I was only following orders." Elliot stopped one step away from him, his ice-cold gaze passing over the trembling old woman before returning to the man. "Whose orders?" he asked, his voice low and even, so even that it was more terrifying than a shout. The debt collector swallowed hard, his legs looking as if they might give way beneath him. "Mr. Pikes," he confessed. "He told us to squeeze every debt in this neighborhood before the end of the month." That name made the air grow heavy. Maggie sat in the car, listening clearly through the slightly open door, and the name Pike pierced her chest like a cold needle. Though at that moment she still didn't fully understand what it meant, Elliot didn't raise his voice. He didn't lift a hand. He only said a few very quiet words to the man, words Maggie couldn't hear, but she saw the debt collector's face turn deathly pale. He nodded again and again, then hurriedly returned the stack of debt papers to the old woman, stammered an apology, and fled as quickly as he could without daring to look back. The whole street fell silent in astonishment. Elliot bent down and said something to the old woman, and for the first time, Maggie saw her trembling body ease with a breath of relief, her eyes brimming as she looked at him as though she were seeing something impossible. When Elliot returned to the car, his face was as calm as if nothing had happened at all. Maggie looked at him, her heart tangled with conflicting emotions. One part of her feared the kind of power that could make a large man tremble like a leaf with only a few words. But another part of her realized that he hadn't used that power to crush the weak. He had used it to stop those who were crushing them. "Do you always do that?" she asked softly, as the car began to roll forward. Elliot looked out the window. "I don't like strong men who prey on the weak," he replied. "There are many things I've done in this life that I'm not proud of, but not that." Maggie fell silent. "Who is Pike?" she asked, her voice quiet but hiding a tremor beneath it. Elliot turned to look at her, as though only then realizing that the name meant more to her than he had thought. "Someone trying to swallow what doesn't belong to him," he answered. "Someone I'll have to deal with sooner or later." Maggie turned her face away, hiding in the darkness beyond the window, the cold feeling spreading through her chest, because she had just heard the name of the man who had destroyed her entire life from the mouth of the man who had just protected suffering people like her. All the way back, Maggie didn't say another word, but inside her mind, a storm was raging. The name Pike kept echoing, over and over again, each time clearer than before, dragging with it fragments of memory she had tried to bury for the past 2 years. When they reached the mansion, she quietly went into her room, sat down on the edge of the bed, and locked her hands together to hide their trembling. Bishop followed her in, lying down at her feet and looking up at her with eyes that seemed to sense the unease rising inside her. She tried to tell herself that there could be many people in the world with the name Pike, that it was only a coincidence, but the more she thought about it, the colder her spine became. The factory where her husband had died, the debts that had risen out of nowhere after his death, the strangers who had been lingering around her little house for the past several months, all of it suddenly tied itself into one long thread, leading back to the same name. That evening, when Elliot stopped by to ask whether she needed anything, Maggie looked up. Her eyes were no longer the eyes of a woman who had just escaped death and felt grateful. They were the eyes of someone who had just touched the edge of a terrible truth. "That man Pike," she said, her voice low, but every word drawn tight as a wire. "Is he the owner of the factories on the east side?" Elliot stopped at the doorway, his gaze sharpening. "Yes," he answered. "Vernon Pike. He owns half the filthy factories in this city and lends money at brutal interest all across the poor neighborhoods. Why are you asking?" Maggie stood, her whole body trembling, not from fear, but from something far more violent. "Because my husband died in one of his factories," she said, her voice breaking. "And the debts that killed my mother came from his hands too." The sentence hung in the air like a blade. Elliot stepped fully into the room, and his eyes were different now, sharp and focused, like an animal that had caught the scent of something dangerous. "Are you sure?" he asked. Maggie nodded, tears finally sliding down her cheeks, but her voice was harder than it had ever been. "I lived for 2 years with that name printed on every debt paper. I can't be mistaken." She wiped at her tears with one hand, and then another thought flashed through her mind, one that made her blood go cold. "That night," she said slowly, as though she were fitting the broken pieces together right in front of him, "the men who tied me up and set fire to my house took documents with them. I thought they were just thieves, but they weren't, were they? They came to take something, and to silence me for good." She lifted her eyes to Elliot, stunned by her own realization. That fire wasn't random. He wanted me dead. Elliot was silent for a long time, and in that silence, Maggie understood that he had reached the same conclusion. A poor widow with no home and no money had no reason to be carefully tied up and burned alive in the night. unless she was holding something dangerous enough that someone needed to erase her along with it. Elliot stepped to the window and stood with his back to her, his shoulders drawn tight. For months now, my men have been reporting that Pike is pushing into areas that were always under my control, he said, his voice low and cold. He's collecting debts in my territory, burning houses in my territory, and he hasn't bothered to ask a single word. He thinks I've grown weak. Elliot turned back, his eyes meeting Maggie's, and in that moment, two paths that had once been separate suddenly became one. Then we have the same enemy, he said. Maggie looked at him, and for the first time since the night of the fire, something entirely new flared through her pain and fear. It was the spark of resolve. He took everything from me, she said softly, each word hardening like steel. I won't let him take my life too without paying the price. Bishop stood, pressing close against her leg, and Elliot looked at the woman before him, realizing that the person he had pulled from that sea of fire was not nearly as weak as her shattered appearance made her seem. The next morning, Elliot suggested taking Maggie back to the burned house one more time, not to say goodbye this time, but to search. If Pike had been reckless enough to set an entire house on fire just to destroy something, then that thing had to have left some trace behind. At first, Maggie shook her head, believing the fire had swallowed everything clean. But Elliot reminded her that men like Pike usually aimed only at what was easy to see, while careful people rarely kept what mattered in a place anyone could see. When they arrived, the house was now nothing more than a collapsed frame of smoke, stained wood, and the smell of ash still lingered in the damp air. Maggie stood silently for a while before the ruins that had once been her home, then drew in a deep breath and stepped inside. She followed her memory, making her way to the corner of the house that had once been the bedroom. Elliot's men moved the half-burned beams aside, and beneath the charred black floorboards, a small cellar corner that even Maggie had almost forgotten slowly revealed itself. It was the place her husband had once said he would use to store things in case of hard times. A dark little hollow he had dug with his own hands, and she hadn't opened it again since the day he died. When the cellar lid was pried up, inside lay an old tin box wrapped in oilcloth, still intact, untouched by the flames. Maggie's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, there was no money, no treasure as someone might have imagined, but a thick stack of papers, copies of records, photographs of accident scenes, and pages filled with the familiar, crowded handwriting of her husband. She turned each page, and the more she read, the paler her face became. It was all the evidence showing that the factory where he had worked had deliberately covered up earlier fatal accidents, falsified safety records, and lied in order to draw enormous insurance payments from the very lives of its workers. Her husband had quietly gathered all of it, recording every name, every date, every number that had been twisted. Maggie sank down in the middle of the ashes, clutching the box tightly to her chest as tears rolled down her face. He knew, she whispered, her voice choking. He knew that place was dangerous. He knew what they were doing. He was trying to expose it, and I never knew. She lifted her face to Elliot, her eyes filled with both pain and shock. For 2 years, I lived right above this and didn't know. I thought he had only stored a few things for emergencies. I never opened it, because every time I looked at that corner, I couldn't bear it. A bitter laugh broke through her tears. He burned down the whole house looking for this, and it was right under his feet all that time. Elliot bent down, took the box from her hands, and turned through a few pages with the eyes of a man who understood the true value of what he was holding. "Do you know what this is?" he said, his voice sinking lower. "This isn't only the reason he wanted you dead. This is the thing that can bury Pike, enough to make him lose everything. Not only his money, but his freedom. Your husband didn't leave you a burden. He left you a weapon." Maggie looked at the box in his hands, and something inside her changed. For 2 years, she had lived like a person in debt, head bowed, enduring, believing she was powerless before the people who had crushed her life. But now she understood that her late husband, even after he was gone, was still reaching out to her with a way to claim justice. She stood, wiped away her tears, and when she spoke, her voice no longer shook. "Then we'll use it," she said. "I don't want to run anymore. I want him to answer for every person he's destroyed." Elliot looked at her for a long while, then nodded, and in his eyes there flickered a respect he rarely gave to anyone. Bishop gave one short bark, as though agreeing, and the 3 shadows left the ashes behind, carrying with them the secret their enemy had burned down an entire house but still could never turn to ash. That evening, after the tin box had been locked away inside Elliot's safe, the entire mansion sank into a rare quiet. Maggie couldn't sleep. She went down to the back porch, where the cool night wind moved through the dark garden, and found Elliot sitting there alone with a glass of liquor he hadn't touched. Bishop lay curled at his feet, but the moment he saw Maggie, the dog lifted his head, wagged his tail, and hurried over to nuzzle her hand. She let out a soft laugh, sat down in the chair beside him, and let the dog rest his head on her lap. "He's been attached to you since the first night," Elliot said, his eyes on the dog, his voice carrying a rare trace of relief. "I raised him from the time he was tiny, and I've never seen him choose anyone as quickly as he chose you." Maggie stroked Bishop's warm fur and smiled. "Maybe he knows I don't have anyone left to be attached to either," she replied, her voice light now, no longer carrying the bitterness of those first days. The two of them sat in silence for a while, sharing the stillness of the night. Strangely, that silence wasn't awkward. It was warm, as though both of them had grown too tired of words and only needed someone sitting nearby so they could breathe. "I used to think this place was full of frightening people," Maggie said softly. "But these past few days, this is the first place in a very long time where I've been able to sleep without worrying that someone would knock on the door in the middle of the night to demand a debt." Elliot turned to look at her. "You're safe here," he said, and after a brief hesitation, he added something even he hadn't expected himself to say. "I'll keep you safe." Maggie lifted her eyes and met his gaze. There was something in those words heavier than an ordinary promise. An emotion he didn't name but she could feel. She knew too little about him, knew that people feared his name, knew that his hands had done things she didn't dare imagine. And yet sitting there, beneath the gentle light of the garden, he didn't look like a crime lord. He only looked like a lonely man learning all over again how to let someone step into his world. "Why are you doing all of this for me?" she asked, not as an accusation, but because she truly didn't understand. Elliot was silent for a long while, his fingers slowly turning the glass. "I've grown used to losing people," he said at last, his voice sinking low. "Used to standing there and watching important things slip out of my hands before I could hold on to them." He looked at the dog lying quietly between them, then raised his eyes to her. "Maybe I'm tired of letting everything drift away." He didn't say it plainly, but Maggie understood. He was saying that he didn't want to lose anyone else, and somehow, she had become one of the things he didn't want to let slip away. Her heart softened a little, with a feeling both warm and unsteady, because she knew she shouldn't let herself grow tender toward a man from this world, but she also knew she couldn't stop it. They said nothing more. They only sat there, two scarred people with a dog forming a bridge between two shores of loneliness, quietly savoring a rare moment of peace. But even inside that warmth, Maggie still felt a vague unease creeping in, as though this peace was too beautiful to last. She looked up at the starless night sky and held Bishop a little tighter, never knowing that out there, in the darkness of the city, the wheels of a conspiracy had already begun to turn, and the price of the secret they had just found would soon come to collect. Across the city, in a dark office on the top floor of a building few people ever visited, Vernon Pike stood beside the glass window and looked down at the streets glowing with lights, his face carrying the look of a man whose patience was slipping away piece by piece. He had thought everything had ended on the night the house went up in flames. He had thought the woman and that deadly secret had both been turned to ash, but the news he had just received made his fingers tighten around the glass of liquor until his knuckles went white. That woman was still alive. Not only was she alive, she was being protected behind the strongest walls in the city, under the rule of the very man Pike was trying to push out. Pike wasn't a man who frightened easily, but he understood exactly how dangerous those documents were. If they got out, everything he had built with blood and lies over so many years would collapse. And he wouldn't only lose his fortune, he would lose his freedom for the rest of his life. A desperate man was a dangerous man, and Pike knew he had only one move left. He had to get the documents back and wipe that woman out before it was too late, no matter whose back she was hiding behind. The problem was that no one could touch anything inside Elliot Crane's walls, unless someone already inside opened the door for him. And just then, his phone vibrated. Pike looked at the screen, and a cold smile slowly spread across his lips. He answered the call. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten our agreement," he said, his voice smooth as oil. On the other end of the line, in a hidden corner of the Crane mansion, Dorsey lowered his voice to a whisper, his eyes flicking around to make sure no one could hear him. "I haven't forgotten," he said, "but you need to be patient. Crane isn't easy to fool. That woman is here, and so is what you're looking for." Pike lifted an eyebrow. "So the box is still intact. Good. Then you know what I need, Dorsey. Get both of them out of Crane's house for me, and you'll have more than Crane has ever paid you in a dozen years of serving him." Dorsey was silent for a moment, and in that silence lived a greed that had been smoldering for a long time. The greed of a man who had grown tired of standing forever in another man's shadow. "I'll find a way," he said quietly, "but I need time, and I need you not to do anything reckless that will make Crane suspicious. When the moment comes, I'll let you know." The call ended. Dorsey slipped the phone into his pocket, straightened the front of his coat, fixed his usual polite smile back onto his lips, and stepped into the hallway as though nothing had happened. But the moment he turned the corner, he froze. Bishop was standing there in the middle of the hallway, blocking his path. The dog didn't bark. It only stood still, head lowered, eyes locked tightly on him, and from deep in its throat came a low, drawn-out growl full of warning. The fur along the back of its neck rose. Dorsey stood motionless, his smile stiffening on his mouth. He and the dog stared at each other through one tense moment, as though the animal had looked straight through his courteous mask and seen what was hidden underneath. "What's wrong with you, you stupid dog?" Dorsey muttered, trying to keep his voice steady, though there was a brief tremor in it he couldn't hide. Just then, Maggie appeared at the end of the hallway. "Bishop?" she called softly, surprised to see the normally gentle dog behave that way. The dog glanced back at her, then reluctantly stepped aside, though it still didn't take its eyes off Dorsey until he had disappeared. Dorsey nodded to Maggie with his familiar, courteous smile, and hurried away. Maggie watched him go, then bent down to stroke Bishop's head, her brow faintly furrowing. "What is it?" she whispered to the dog. "Did you smell something?" Bishop only gave a soft whine deep in his throat and pressed his head against her leg, and Maggie, never knowing she had just stood only a few steps away from a conspiracy, merely smiled and thought the dog must be in a strange mood today. Then she led him back to her room, leaving the hallway to sink into darkness with the seed of betrayal that had just taken root. Over the next few days, Maggie and Elliot sat down together many times, carefully discussing how to bring Pike down. Maggie understood that the documents alone wouldn't be enough. Pike was rich enough and cunning enough to deny, to bribe, to twist everything, and to turn paper evidence into something worthless in court. What they needed was for the man himself to admit his crimes, a confession that couldn't be denied. And so, little by little, a plan began to take shape. Maggie would be the one to contact Pike first, pretending to be an exhausted and frightened widow, ready to hand over the documents in exchange for her life and a chance to be left alone. She would arrange to meet him, and during that meeting, she would carefully guide him into boasting about what he had done, while a hidden recording device captured every word. It was a dangerous plan, and Elliot opposed it from the very beginning. "I'm not letting you walk into the wolf's den alone," he said, his voice hard. "Pike is cornered, and a cornered man has nothing left to lose." But Maggie didn't back down. "He'll never lower his guard in front of you or your men," she replied. "But in front of a woman he believes he has already crushed, he'll be arrogant. That's the weakness of men like him." In the end, they reached an agreement. Maggie would go in to meet Pike, but she wouldn't be alone. Elliot's men would surround the entire area, lying in wait at every entrance and exit, and Elliot himself would stay close by, only one signal away from her. She would carry a hidden communication device, so he could hear everything that happened and rush in the moment there was any sign of trouble. They chose an old abandoned warehouse near the harbor as the meeting place, a wide-open location that would be easier to control, and they planned every smallest detail, every position where a man would stand, every escape route, every backup plan. Maggie memorized all of it, repeating it again and again in her mind until she could close her eyes and still see it clearly. The night before the meeting, she sat with Bishop for a long time, her hand buried in his warm fur as though searching for courage. Elliot found her there. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. "There are still other ways." Maggie shook her head. "I've been running for 2 years," she answered, looking straight ahead. "I don't want someone else fighting in my place anymore. This is my fight. For my husband. For my mother. I need to do this myself." Elliot looked at her for a long while, then nodded, and in his eyes there was both worry and respect. What neither of them knew was that every part of that careful plan had already been leaked, Dorsey, the man who had stood inside those discussions as Elliot's trusted right hand, had memorized every detail and secretly passed it all to Pike. Now the ruthless factory owner was no longer forced to react blindly to a trap. He already knew every move his enemies planned to make. He knew Maggie would come. He knew she intended to record him. He knew where Elliot's men would be lying in wait. And a man who already knows the trap has more than enough time to set a larger one. Pike had no intention of letting the meeting unfold the way Maggie had planned. He would turn everything around, changing the hunter into the prey. That morning, Maggie put on a simple coat, carefully hid the recording device, and drew a deep breath in front of the mirror. The face looking back at her was no longer the face of the desperate woman who had nearly died in that sea of fire. It was the face of someone ready to confront the man who had destroyed her life. Elliot was waiting for her in the hall. When she came downstairs, he looked at her for a moment, then placed his hand on her shoulder. "Listen for my signal," he reminded her. "If anything feels wrong, all you have to do is say the code word, and I'll be there before you can take another breath." Maggie nodded, forcing a small smile to reassure him. Bishop followed her all the way to the door, whining softly, pawing lightly at her leg as though he wanted to hold her back, his eyes shining with an unusual unease. Maggie bent down and hugged his head. "I'll be back soon," she whispered. Then she stepped into the car, never knowing that every piece she thought she still held had already been turned over long ago by a traitor's hand, and that she was walking straight into a trap laid and waiting for her alone. The old warehouse by the harbor stood silent beneath the gray sky, its rusted iron door creaking in the wind. Maggie stepped inside, each footstep echoing through the wide, empty space. Pike was already there, sitting on a chair in the middle of the warehouse, his arms folded across his chest, his face easing into a smile that sent a chill down her spine. "So you came," he said, his voice thick with satisfaction. "I thought you might be smart enough to run far away." Maggie kept her calm, one hand resting on the pocket where the fake documents they had prepared were hidden. "I brought what you need," she said. "I only want to be left alone." But the moment the words left her mouth, she realized something was wrong. Pike didn't look cautious, not like a man about to receive evidence that could convict him. His smile widened, and then he snapped his fingers. From the shadows of the tall storage racks, several figures stepped out, sealing off every exit. "Did you think I didn't know about your little trick?" Pike said, rising from his chair. "The recorder hidden on you, Crane's men lying in wait outside. I know everything. There's a rat in your protector's house, sweetheart. And it told me every last thing." Maggie went still, the blood in her body seeming to freeze. She stepped back, her trembling fingers pressing the hidden signal button beneath her coat. But in that same instant, she understood that if Pike had known everything in advance, Elliot's men outside had probably been sent elsewhere or blocked off already. She was alone. Pike gave a nod, and two men moved toward her. Maggie turned to run, but the way out had already been cut off. One man grabbed her arm. She struggled, fighting to tear herself free, her heart pounding like a frantic drum. In that moment of chaos, another man lunged from behind, and she didn't see the hand swinging down. But at that life-or-death instant, a black shadow shot through the warehouse door like an arrow. Bishop. The dog had secretly followed the car from the beginning, and now he crashed straight into the middle of the circle like a wrecking ball, slamming his colossal frame forward and using his massive body to shield Maggie from the blow coming down. A sharp, terrible sound rang out, followed by the animal's cry of pain tearing through the air. Bishop collapsed onto the warehouse floor. Maggie screamed, dropping to her knees beside the dog, her hands shaking as she held him. "Bishop, no," she sobbed. "Don't." The dog lay there panting hard, his brown eyes still trying to lift toward her, his tail moving faintly as though he wanted to reassure her that he was still there. Just then, the warehouse door burst open. Elliot charged in, followed by a handful of men who were truly loyal to him, the ones Dorsey hadn't been able to send away. He had sensed something was wrong, had never fully trusted the plan, and had arrived in time. His gaze swept the room, stopped on Maggie kneeling beside Bishop, and something inside him shattered. The fight erupted. Elliot drove straight into Pike's men with a ferocity even his own followers had never seen. His blows were fast, clean, and decisive, cutting down every man who blocked his path. His people flooded in to support him, and within moments, Pike's hired hands were completely overwhelmed. Pike saw the tide turn and hurried toward the back door, desperately seeking a way out through the shadows. When the last noise faded, Elliot didn't care about the men who had fallen. He ran to Maggie and dropped down beside the dog. "Bishop," he called, and the voice of the man the whole city feared broke apart, trembling like the voice of a child. He placed his hand on the dog's body, felt the faint rhythm of his breathing, and for the first time in 3 years, the ice wrapped around Elliot's heart melted completely. His eyes reddened. "Hold him," he ordered his men, his voice choking. "Call the best veterinarian. Right now. I don't care what it costs." Maggie looked at that powerful man kneeling on the cold warehouse floor, holding his dog with all the tenderness and desperation in him, and through her tears, she saw clearly the real person beneath that iron shell, a man who knew how to love with a depth that frightened her, and who was terrified of losing yet another thing he cherished. Elliot's men strained to carefully lift Bishop's heavy, wounded body, urgently carrying him out to the car to take him to the veterinarian, and in that brief moment, just as the chaos had begun to settle, a figure stepped into the warehouse through the back entrance. Dorsey. He stood there, no longer wearing his usual courteous smile, a gun in his hand aimed straight at Elliot. Behind him, Pike, the man everyone thought had been cut off, stepped out again with a look of triumph, because the escape route Elliot's men believed they had sealed shut was the very one Dorsey had left open. Elliot turned, and when his eyes landed on the face of the traitor, his whole body seemed to turn to stone. "Dorsey," he said, his voice dropping low, cold, yet beneath it lay a wound Maggie could hear. 10 years. I trusted you for 10 years. Dorsey curled his lip, but the hand holding the gun wasn't steady. "That's right. 10 years standing behind you, cleaning up what you left behind, living in your shadow," he hissed. "Did you ever think I wanted more than that too? Pike paid me what you never would." Elliot looked at him, and in that moment, for the second time in his life, he had been betrayed by the very person to whom he had given his trust. An old wound that had only just begun to close, now torn open all over again. That pain made him freeze for only 1 second, but 1 second was enough. Pike drew his own gun and aimed it at Elliot, his eyes flashing with the hunger of a man about to erase the last obstacle in his path. 2 gun barrels pointed at the man who had just lost his caution in the pain of betrayal. "Crane," Pike hissed. "Today is the end of your empire." Maggie, still kneeling in the dim pool of light in the middle of the warehouse, saw everything. She saw Elliot standing there, not like an unbeatable crime lord, but like a man pinned down by grief, standing on the edge of death. And in that instant, something inside her burst into flame. She was no longer the desperate woman waiting to be saved. She was the only one left who could act. Her hand, while holding Bishop, had brushed against a heavy iron bar lying on the warehouse floor. But she knew an iron bar couldn't defeat 2 guns. Her real weapon was somewhere else. She remembered what Elliot had once told her about the communication device hidden inside her coat, the one that was still on, still transmitting every sound to the loyal men he had left, and to an entire line she had secretly prepared as a backup plan. She had never told anyone about, not even Elliot, an open call to someone she knew at the police department, someone who had recorded everything Pike had just admitted. Maggie sprang to her feet. "Afu!" she shouted, her voice ringing through the warehouse, loud enough to pull both men's attention toward her. "You just admitted everything. The murder, the fraud, all of it. And this recorder isn't the only thing that heard you." Pike froze, the color shifting in his face. The instant he was distracted and turned the gun toward Maggie was the instant Elliot needed. He lunged forward like a storm, knocking the gun from Pike's hand, and at the same time, Elliot's loyal men, having heard the distress signal, burst in through the front entrance and slammed Dorsey down before he could pull the trigger. Dorsey's gun went off, the shot flying harmlessly into the warehouse ceiling. In a few short seconds, the entire game had turned. Pike was pinned to the floor, screaming in madness, while Dorsey was disarmed, the traitor's face drained of every trace of blood. Elliot stood in the middle of the warehouse, breathing hard, then turned to look at Maggie. The woman he had pulled from the sea of fire, the woman he had thought he was protecting, had just saved his life. She had risked herself by stepping into the line of fire to give him a chance. In his eyes now, there was not only astonishment, but deep respect, and something neither of them yet dared to name. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, stepping toward her. Maggie nodded, her whole body still trembling, but her eyes were bright. "I told you," she replied, her voice choked yet steady. "This is my fight. I don't only know how to run anymore. The sound of sirens wailed from far away, then drew closer and closer, red and blue lights flashing across the broken warehouse windows. The open call Maggie had secretly prepared had done exactly what it was meant to do. The person she knew at the police department, an officer who had once investigated her husband's death, but had been forced to close the case because there was no evidence and because of pressure from men with money, had now heard everything. Every word Pike admitted about the murder disguised as an accident, about the falsified safety records, about the insurance money he had taken from the lives of poor workers. This time, no power in the world could force the file shut again. When the police rushed into the warehouse, Pike was still screaming his denials, struggling in desperation, but it was already too late. The stack of documents Maggie's husband had traded his life to collect, the very thing Pike had burned down an entire house trying to destroy, was now placed directly in the prosecutor's hands as the final piece of the puzzle, fitting perfectly with the confession that had just been recorded. On one side was the undeniable physical evidence she had preserved, and on the other was the verbal trap she and Elliot had set together. Two pieces from two people came together into a complete sentence with no gap left for escape. Pike was handcuffed right there in the middle of the warehouse. When he was led past Maggie, he stopped, his bloodshot eyes glaring at her with all the hatred of a man who had just lost everything. "You think this is over?" he hissed through his teeth. Maggie didn't look away from him. She stepped forward and stood straight in front of the man who had destroyed her entire family. And for the first time in 2 years, she looked at him without the smallest trace of fear. "My husband's name was Daniel," she said, her voice calm, though every word carved itself into the air. "My mother's name was Eleanor. They weren't numbers in your insurance files. They were human beings, and they died because of your greed. Today you're going to remember their names, because those are the names that will follow you for the rest of your life behind bars." Pike opened his mouth as if to say something, but Maggie had already turned away, refusing him the chance to speak another word. That was the greatest contempt she could give him, the contempt of a person who had risen from the ashes where he had believed she was buried. Dorsey was taken away with him. When he passed Elliot, the traitor lowered his head, not daring to look up at the man he had sold out. Elliot didn't say a single word to him. To Dorsey, that silence weighed more heavily than any curse, because it said he had thrown away with his own hands the most precious thing Pike's money could never buy back: trust, and a place beside the man who had once considered him a brother. The law would seal Pike behind bars, while the business of the underworld was something Elliot handled in his own way, quietly and thoroughly, to make sure that no matter how Pike struggled from prison, he would never again have enough power or money to reach outside and hurt anyone else. The filthy empire he had built with blood and lies collapsed in a single night. The factories were sealed off, the assets investigated, and the people who had once bowed their heads in fear of him could finally lift them and breathe in relief. When only the two of them remained in the warehouse, surrounded by dim light and the damp smell of the harbor, Maggie stood still, letting the strange feeling of freedom slowly seep into her heart. For 2 years, she had lived beneath the shadow of one name, and now that shadow had vanished. Elliot stepped up beside her. "You did it," he said softly. Maggie shook her head and looked up at him. "We did it," she replied. "I never could have done it alone." But then the faint smile on her lips disappeared as a thought came rushing back, and she quickly turned to him, her eyes filled with worry. "Bishop," she breathed. "We have to get to Bishop now." They rushed to the veterinary clinic in the middle of the night, and the hours of waiting that followed were the longest hours either of them had ever lived through. Maggie sat beside Elliot on the long bench outside the hallway. They didn't say much, only waited together in silence, and she realized that the powerful man sitting next to her was gripping his hand so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. When the operating room door finally opened, the veterinarian stepped out with a tired face but a faint smile. "He made it," he said. "This dog has an extraordinarily strong heart. He fought to live. In a few weeks, he'll recover completely." Maggie burst into tears, and this time they were tears of relief. Beside her, she saw Elliot's shoulders loosen, as though an entire stone had been lifted from him. When they were allowed in to see him, Bishop was lying there, his body wrapped in bandages, but his brown eyes were still bright, and the moment he saw them, his tail tapped softly against the cushion as he tried to lift his head in greeting. Elliot knelt beside him, laid a hand on the dog's head, and Maggie heard him whisper a very quiet "thank you," the gratitude of a man offered to the creature that had taught him his heart had never truly died. The days that followed passed like a kind of healing. Bishop recovered little by little, and each day he grew stronger seemed to bring a new joy back into the whole house. He began limping after Maggie everywhere again, lying in the sun on the porch again, and before long, he could run through the garden as though nothing had ever happened. Meanwhile, beyond those walls, justice finally called the dead by their proper names. The case was reopened, and this time no one could bury it. Daniel's death was recognized not as an accident, but as the result of deliberate negligence and deceit. His name, together with the names of the other workers who had fallen in silence, was spoken, cleared, and restored. The illegal debts people had once forced Maggie to carry were declared void. Her little house, the piece of land Pike had once tried to seize, was legally returned to her. Maggie stood in court, no longer the woman who had bowed her head and endured 2 years before, but a woman who raised her voice clearly for her husband, for her mother, and for all the other families who had been forced to swallow their grief in silence. Many of them came to thank her, saying that because of her, their loved ones had finally been given justice. She realized that when her pain was turned into action, it had become a light for others. And Elliot changed too. The people who had been close to him for years began to notice something different in the man who had once been as cold as ice. He was still powerful, still decisive, still the name that made wicked men draw back. But now there was something softer in his eyes, an empty place that had been filled. He began using his influence in ways he had never thought of before, quietly helping the poor neighborhoods where Maggie had once lived, silently standing behind the vulnerable without needing anyone to know. One afternoon, while all 3 of them sat on the porch, Bishop lying snugly between them with his bandages removed, Maggie turned to look at Elliot. "You know," she said softly, "there was a time when I thought I'd never escape that night. I thought I'd always be the woman tied inside the fire." Elliot looked at her, his gaze gentle. "You were never only that woman," he replied. "Even when you couldn't see it yourself, I did." Maggie smiled, and in that peaceful moment, she understood that the ashes of the past had finally stopped smoldering, and on the scorched ground of the years behind her, a new green shoot was quietly rising. Autumn came softly that year, carrying cool winds that scattered a layer of golden leaves over the garden behind the mansion. Maggie had returned to her little house now, rebuilding it on the very piece of land that had once been burned to the ground, and every morning she still drove to Elliot's place, which had become an indispensable part of her life. They had never rushed to give a name to the feeling growing between them, but both of them understood it had been there for a long time, quietly taking root through the nights they had sat together on the porch, through the times they had faced danger side by side, through a dog who had used his own body to join 2 hearts that had seemed beyond repair. One afternoon, as the 3 of them walked together along the narrow path by the hillside, Bishop trotted ahead, strong and full of life as though he had never carried a wound on his body, and Elliot suddenly stopped and turned to look at Maggie. "I lived too long in a world made only of fear and suspicion," he said, his voice low and sincere, in a way he had never once allowed himself before. "I used to think a man like me had no right to hope for anything good. But then you came into my life, and you taught me that even someone who thinks he's lost everything can still begin again." Maggie looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "You pulled me out of the fire," she answered softly. "And I suppose I pulled you out of something even colder than fire." They looked at each other, and this time there was no distance, no hesitation. Only 2 people who had saved each other in their own ways, now choosing to remain beside one another, not because either one needed to be protected, but because both of them deserved a new beginning. Elliot reached out his hand, and Maggie placed hers in it, their 2 hands, once scarred by the past, now weaving together beneath the gentle afternoon light. Bishop circled back around their feet, barking joyfully, as though he understood that at last, the small family he had risked his life to protect had truly become whole. And standing there on the road covered in golden leaves, the woman once left behind for the flames, and the man the whole city had once feared walked together toward a new life, where the past was no longer a chain, but only a healed scar reminding them of everything they had survived in order to find each other. Maggie and Elliot's story reminds us of one simple but profound truth, that kindness and dignity can take root even in the darkest places, and that no one, no matter how broken, is ever undeserving of a chance to stand again and begin anew. Sometimes, the person who saves us doesn't come in the form we expected, and sometimes, we ourselves become the one who brings light to someone who seems to have nothing left to lose. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and share it to encourage us to keep bringing meaningful stories to you every day. How do you feel about Maggie and Elliot's journey? Leave a comment and tell us about the deepest stirrings in your heart, because every line you share is something we truly treasure. May you, the person listening to this story, always have abundant health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next stories.